Hello and welcome to part 2 in this series for using Blender's game engine for architectural visualization. And in the first part, I just modeled a small basic room to use as a demonstration, and then I did some retopology to lower the vertex count. And so now it's time to start assigning materials. So I'll click the Material tab, and I'll change the material name to Walls. And now I'll create a new material, and this one will be called Ceiling. And so I'll go into Front Orthographic View and press Z to go into Wireframe and then choose Vertex Select. And now I can use B to box select those top vertices and assign those to the ceiling material. And now I'll create a third material and call this one Floor. And then box select those bottom vertices and assign those to that material. Now go into camera view and position it so that you have a good view of the interior. And I like to set this to material view just while setting up the textures. Now let's bring our node editor back, and right now it's set to world materials, so we need to set that back to object materials. And with the wall material, we'll click use nodes. And then with the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, you can just press Ctrl T, which adds the texture and the coordinate nodes. And for the walls, I'm just using this painted white brick texture from CG Textures. So I'll use a cube projection, and it's a little big, so I'll scale this on the X and Y to 3, and that's better. Now I'll make a little bit of space. I'll move the diffuse material out, and I'll duplicate the texture node with Shift D. And I'll just X out this texture and change it to non-color data. And I assume that by this point most of you know how to generate normal maps and specularity maps, but if you don't, there are a lot of resources online to show you how. There are a lot of different programs. I use a plugin from GIMP. So I'll just plug the texture into the normal input on that material and then type Shift A and go to Vector Normal Map. And we can adjust the strength of this once we're in render view, but for right now I'll duplicate this texture node and plug it into the mapping coordinates. And I'll X out that texture and open a new one, and now I'll find my specularity texture. And I'm not going to plug this into anything. We'll be doing something with this later. So right now let's leave this the way that it is, and we'll set up our floor material the same way. And the quickest way to do that is go back to the wall material and select everything with A, and then type Control C, which copies all of those nodes. And then go back to the floor material and delete it with X, and then type Control V, which pastes that in. If you're on a Mac, it's Command V and Command C. That's copy and paste. So now you just need to replace all of those brick textures with the floor textures that you have selected. And I'm just using a wood floor texture. But I'm going to set the scale back to 1. And I want the floorboards going the other way, so I'll rotate it on Z 90 degrees. Okay, that looks better, and now we need to replace the normal map too, because we can still see that the normal strength from the brick. So I'll just X out this texture and replace it with a normal map for the wood floor. And even in material view, I can tell that that's too strong. So I'll take the strength down quite a bit. Alright, so now we just need to add in our specularity texture, which again won't be plugged into the material. It won't have any effect on the material, but we'll need it later for when we bake our textures. So finally, let's do the ceiling material, which is going to be really easy. We're just going to add the texture to it, which I have this plaster texture that I'm going to use for the ceiling. Something really simple. And I'll take the scale up to 3 on the X and the Y. And that's it. I'm not going to add any normal maps or anything to that. Although, if you want that texture to react to the lighting, you can just plug it into the displacement on the material output, which even in material view, you can see a slight difference in what's happening. But let's add in a converter math node, and we'll switch this to multiply, and we'll take the value down slightly. We can readjust that in the render view, but that will control the strength of that bump. So now let's go into rendered view, and we can take a look at what our scene looks like. And I like it. Obviously, there would be a lot more detail if we had furniture and objects in the scene, and frames around the doors and the windows and so forth. But I think it looks pretty good. So let's change the node editor to the UV image editor. And with our model, I'm going to select the floor material and choose select, which selects all of those faces. And I'm going to type P and choose separate by selection. And the reason I'm separating the model into different objects is because later in GLSL, it will be easier to work with nodes if they're all separate objects. But now that it is a separate object, it doesn't really need a lot of these extra edges, so we can clean this up a bit. Let's select the rest of the object, and we'll press H to hide. And now we can see what we're doing with the floor a little more clearly. So I'll just tab into edit mode and select everything with A. And then I'll type X and choose limited dissolve, which will basically clear out all of the edges, and then we'll need to come back in and reconnect some of them. So I'll select this one and shift select the one on the opposite side, and then type J, and that will join those vertices. So then I'll just join the other side as well. And because we've done that, we've actually distorted the UVs. So if we go to material view, we can see that that the UVs are warped now, and our texture looks really weird. So we'll just choose cube projection again, which will reset it back to the way that it was originally. Now I'll create a new texture, and I'll just call it floor. And I'll leave the size at 1024 by 1024. And I'll click OK. And then I want to organize these UVs into the texture space so that I'm using as much of the texture space as possible, but I don't want to I don't want it to affect the way that it's unwrapped currently. So if I go over to my object data and I create a new UV map, and I'll just call this one bake, now I can rearrange the UVs in the texture space without affecting the original UVs. And so you want the render camera highlighted next to the UV map, but you want the bake map highlighted in blue. So it's rendering from the UV map to the bake texture. And now if I press U, I can choose project from view. And because the main focus is going to be on the center room, I'm going to scale this up so that it's taking up most of the texture space, and then the outside rooms can take up whatever texture space is available. And you may have also noticed that 3 of the faces that make up the floor are actually n-gons, because they have more than 4 vertices. These 2 in particular, and then the center main part of the floor as well. I'm not really in the habit of using n-gons very often, but in this case it really isn't a big deal. There really isn't any sense in adding more vertices just to connect so that everything becomes quads. It won't have any negative impact on the overall model at the end. So once you get everything positioned in and you're using as much of the texture space as possible, I always like to press P to pin everything down. and that way if I accidentally unwrap it again, it won't affect those UVs. And now if we look at the model and we see our texture looks really big right now, and that's only because we have our bake map selected. So if I were to go back and select the UV map, you can see that it goes back to normal. So now I want to do the same thing for the ceiling. I'm going to go into wireframe and I'm going to select the entire ceiling and then type P and choose separate by selection. And now once again it's its own object. So the first thing we can do is go back to our materials, and it only needs the ceiling material, so we can now delete the floor and the wall material from that object. We can do the same thing with the floors. And of course we can do some retopology. So if we tab into edit mode and select everything with A, and then type X and choose limited dissolve, and then type U and choose cube projection again, which would fix any warped UVs. And so just like we did with the floor, we need to go back to our object data, and under UV maps we need to create a new one, and I'm going to call this one bake as well. And because nothing on our ceiling is connected, we can just use a simple unwrap and then fit all of this into the texture space as well. And just like before, the main part of the ceiling is what I want to use most of the texture space for. And then whatever is left, I'll try to fit the two smaller pieces into. And I'll type P to pin those down as well. And now I can start working on the walls, which will be the most challenging part of the model, just because there's a lot of geometry and more faces to work with. But there is a way that we can potentially reduce the amount of faces and UVs we have to work with in the texture space. Because as you can see, there are indeed a lot of them. So let's create our bake map. And then we can start organizing the UVs in the texture space. Okay, so because our main focus is going to be this room, this center room, that means that we will never see some faces in our model. For instance, these on the other side of these outer walls. And because we never see them, they don't need any texture. So I can type X and delete those faces. And we will have to add those faces back in before we bake, because otherwise we'll have weird lighting issues, but ultimately we'll be able to remove them again at the end. But as you can see, even in game mode, in the camera view, you'll never see that the other side of that wall is missing. So it's good to remove any of those spaces that you won't see when working with UVs, because trying to fit all of the UVs into the texture space is so much like a puzzle that you want to make it as easy on yourself as possible. Okay, so with these outer walls selected, I'm going to press U and choose a simple unwrap, and then rotate this piece so that it matches the other side. Then I'm just going to move it out of the texture space temporarily. And then I'll select this large wall and go into left orthographic view by holding Control and typing 3 on the number pad. And then I'll do project from view. And because this is part of the main room, it should get more texture space. So I'll scale it up and position it in the corner of the texture. And then select all of these faces on the opposite side of the wall. So if I go into edge mode and I just select all of these edges around the window, I can type Control E and choose Mark Seam. And then I can just select one corner on each of these windows and add another seam, which will make this easier to unwrap later. So Control E and Mark Seam. Okay, so now we'll go into face select mode. And on the corner, if I hold Alt and click with the mouse, I can select the whole entire area. And then from right orthographic view, I'll do a project from view. And then I'll scale this up to be roughly the same size as the wall on the opposite side. And now let's select the faces around the doorways. And for this, I'll just type U and do a simple unwrap as well. And then rotate this one so that it matches the other. And here's where you can get a little creative when it comes to utilizing texture space. So if I rotate this bottom piece, I've created this little window that I can potentially fit more UVs within. But for now, I'll move it off to the side. And now I will select the faces that make up the doorways. And then do a simple unwrap along with these window frames as well. So type U and then choose unwrap, and that will unwrap all of those nicely together. And that should be everything. So let's select everything with A, and then we can start organizing these within the texture space. So I'll move this wall over and this one directly underneath of it and scale it so that it's the same size. And then I'll use B to box select and move these out of the way. And position these in. So all of these parts of the wall, they need the most amount of texture space because that's the center part. These outside pieces don't really need very much space at all, since the first person perspective will probably never enter those rooms. So I can scale this down. I'll fit one piece within that little window that we created, and then I'll move the other piece directly below it. And then I'll just box select the remaining pieces and rotate it on 90 degrees. And then move it over to fill in the rest of the texture space. And we actually did a pretty good job of actually filling it all in, so I'm pretty pleased with it. Okay, so you remember when I said that there could be lighting issues if we deleted those faces. So let me quickly just show you what I mean. If I go into rendered view, you can see that there are these areas of light, of sunlight coming in because we removed those faces. So we need to now put those faces back in just for baking the textures. And that way the lighting will be more realistic, and then we can delete them again afterwards. So I'm going to use edge select and select the inside of the doorway and then the wall on the other side, and then press F, which adds a face to those connecting edges. So I can do the same thing on the other side. Just select this edge and this one and press F, and then these two edges as well, and F to add a face, and then just do the same thing, of course, with this side. And we may have to do some correction with our UVs after this, but that will be really easy to do. It's just as easy as just moving them out of the texture space. So let's go back into our rendered view. And now you can see that those beams of light that were in the back room are now indeed gone. So that's good. But now if we go back to our UV image editor, and then tab into edit mode and select everything, we can see that those UVs are in fact there. So let's unpin them really quickly by just pressing Alt P. And then I will just select the faces, those 6 faces that make up those 2 walls. And I'll just unwrap them normally and then move them out to the side. And now we're ready to start baking our textures, but we don't want to do them combined. Instead, we want to do them individually. And the very first texture that we want to bake is a light map, which is just a combination of all of the lighting effects and shadows. So if we disconnect the texture from the diffuse material, but leave the normal map plugged in, then you're getting all of that lighting detail. And the Cycles render engine actually does factor in the shadows from normal maps as well. So it's very cool. Okay, so let's first bake the floor texture. So I'll select the floor and then go back to the object data and make sure that the bake map is highlighted in blue. And now we need to tell Blender where to bake the texture to. So if we go over to our material in the node editor and we type Shift A and choose texture, image texture, and then we select from the options here the texture that we created, which is just called floor. And it's very important that we leave this texture highlighted in yellow. It needs to be the active selected node. And now we can come over to our render settings and make a few adjustments. The first of which is probably the most important, and that's under sampling. You need to set the amount of render samples. And for baking textures, I recommend doing at least 1,000, but if you have the time, you can potentially go double that to 2,000. You also want to turn off reflective and refractive caustics if you're not baking any caustics in your scene, because that will reduce the noise greatly. And just in case you don't know, caustics are just the refraction of light through materials like glass. So if you don't have any glass in your scene, you really don't need to keep those on. So. But I think that that's basically it for all of the other render settings to prepare for baking our textures. So if we open this little bake tab, I mean, if you wanted, you could deselect, you could uncheck the glossy or maybe the subsurface, but I think I'm just going to leave them checked. And then when you're ready, you just want to click the little bake tab. And when it's finished baking, which could potentially take a long time, you'll have this very cool light map for the floor. So let's move on to the next material, which we will do the ceiling. So we'll click this little plus tab, which adds a new texture, and we'll call this one ceiling. And we'll leave it at 1024 by 1024. And now let's select the ceiling in object mode. And if you're using the same method that I was by just plugging the texture through the math node into the displacement on the material output, you might want to check in the render view to make sure that the strength of that bump isn't too strong. But I'm pretty happy with what I have now. So I'm just going to add a texture and then select that ceiling texture from the drop-down box. And I'm still at 1,000 samples, which is good, so I'm ready to bake this texture as well. And now finally we need to bake the wall texture, which I'm going to make a little bigger. So I'll create a new texture and call it walls. And I'm going to double the size, so it's going to be 2048 by 2048. And remember that you can bake textures as large as you'd like and then scale them down later if the file size is too big. But for this, I think 2048 will work just fine. And I can delete this floor and ceiling material from this object because it only needs the walls material. And so in the node editor with the walls material selected, I can type Shift A and add an image texture. And then of course select the walls texture that we just created. And then if everything looks good in our render settings, then we can just click on the Bake tab. And we have our wall light map. So that's it for part 2, and in part 3 we'll be doing some more texture work. So I hope you guys have a great week, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.